In small town Oklahoma, word of mouth travels at a terrifying kind of speed. Before my family even unpacked moving boxes, the word on the street was that the new preacher's kid was going to be a football star. The town had built up a whole set of expectations for me before I even stepped in the local high school, ninth grade. They were, to put it mildly, sorely disappointed. I was a lot of things then, but certainly not a legendary athlete, was not one of them. You live in glass house when your dad is the pastor in a town. Everyone always is watching. One afternoon, I was about 15 years old. I decided to take a joyride in my dad's car. I did not have a license, but I did have a desperate need to feel for some kind of freedom. I drove out past the edge of the town where the pavement ends. I was having the time of my life kicking up red Oklahoma dust in those empty back roads. I felt completely invisible. Nobody was watching me. I was just out there. Not entirely sure why, but I decided somewhere along the stretch suddenly that I needed to turn around and head home. I pulled up to a completely empty, dusty intersection and attempted a very clumsy 5-point turn. I misjudged the shoulder and my tires slipped off the graded gravel and I ended up helplessly stuck in a ditch. Panic set in and I immediately gunned the engine, tires spun, dirt went everywhere, but there was no movement. I sat there in the scorching heat with the engine off, staring at the horizon, waiting for my impending doom. I was miles from home and entirely out of options. Eventually, I saw a cloud of dust approaching from the distance. A car pulled up and slowed down in my father's SCD sedan. I rolled down the window, ready to beg the stranger for a tow. It was one of my teachers, my typing teacher. Of all the people in the county, it was a woman who graded my assignments. She helped pull me out of the ditch, and she was very gracious about it. But needless to say, my parents found out, and I was grounded for 6 months. That was the reality of living in a tight-knit community. People know exactly who you are, and when you drive around and fall into a ditch, everyone knows. There is a strange vulnerability of being known that kind of way. We smile at the grocery store, we wave to people while we walk through the neighborhood, but we all know the unspoken stories, many of the people around us. We know whose marriage is quietly hanging on a thread, whose business went under last year. We know the mistakes, the whispers, the scandals, the quiet failures that people try to desperately hide. Knowing a list of facts about someone is not the same as truly actually knowing them. Sometimes knowing all those facts just gives us a convenient excuse to stop seeing them as human beings. We use their past to build an invisible fence around our own lives. We desperately want to be seen, but we are absolutely terrified of being exposed. We do not want anyone to know that we're stuck in the dirt on the side of the road. We crave a deep connection, but we settle for shallow, polite pleasantries because it's much safer. We build walls because bridges are far too dangerous. There is a story about a woman who spent her entire life trying to avoid her own neighbor. She lived in a small Samaritan town called Sekar. Everyone in the town knew her business. They knew she had been married 5 times, and they knew the man she was currently living with was not her husband. Maybe she had made a long string of terrible choices. Maybe she was simply a victim of the brutal patriarchal system that passed widow from brother to brother just to ensure survival. It did not matter to the people in the town. They had already made up their minds. They had definitely defined her entirely by her worst days and her deepest wounds. She just wanted to get some water. She walked out to Jacob's well in the absolute dead of heat that day. It was about noon. Most of the women in the village would have gone to the well in the cool early morning to draw water, laughing and sharing stories of the news of the day. But this woman went out when the sun was blistering and the streets were empty. She went at noon because she was tired of the whispers. She was rather not hear it. She was exhausted from the sideways glances and the heavy judgment of her neighbors. She carried a heavy water jar, but the shame she carried was undeniably heavier. When she arrived at the well, she found a Jewish man sitting there in the dust. The tension in the moment would have been thick enough to cut. The animosity between Jews and Samaritans was not a polite disagreement. It was an ancient, venomous, and systemic hatred. Jewish travelers would cross the Jordan River and walk miles out of their way just to avoid stepping on Samaritan soil. A Jewish rabbi did not speak to women, let alone in public, and a Jewish person absolutely did not share a drink within the container from a Samaritan. It was a rigid, unyielding social barrier. Do not cross. We understand something about those kind of barriers in our own history, more recent history. The systems we build to keep people apart are remarkably stubborn. In 1947, a 24-year-old woman named Mary Stive was traveling through the Deep South from her home in New Jersey. She was an outsider experiencing the absolute rigidity of the legal separation for the very first time. She walked into a public facility and encountered two water fountains situated side by side, explicitly marked with the sign that read white and colored. For a young white woman from the north, the sight was deeply jarring. It was not the dramatic, explosive violence of newspaper headlines. It was the quiet, structural coldness of it. She realized in that moment, for segregation to take hold, the terrible power over society, it had to force its way into the most basic, mundane human actions. It had to regulate something as simple as quenching a person's thirst. Nobody told her which fountain to use. Nobody had to. The signs did all the work on their own. In segregated South, a white person drinking from a black fountain was seen as a violent disruption of the social order. It was an act to provoke immediate anger and hostility. The reverse carried far greater danger. For a black person to cross that same line risked not just hostility, but arrest, beating, and maybe even a mob. Consequences a white person crossing the other direction never had to fear. And yet Mary stood there alone and felt the silent, crushing weight of the space around her. She ultimately chose not to drink from either fountain. She walked away entirely rather than test that well by herself. She was thirsty, but the cost of crossing the barrier alone, with no one standing beside her, was simply too high. She turned her back on the water and walked away. We can't judge her too harshly for walking away. We walk away from the well every single day. We look at the deep divisions in our own city and we decide it's simply too risky to cross the street. The prophet Micah tells us exactly what God requires of us. God requires for us to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. We love the idea of justice when it's neat and theoretical concept discussed in Sunday school. We love the idea of kindness when it means dropping a canned food into a donation bin. But we almost always simply skip over the humility part. I came across the thought as I was preparing for my sermon today that I've not been able to shake. Walking humbly is the absolute only way we're going to be able to build bridges. You cannot build a bridge while you're standing on a pedestal. You cannot build a bridge while you're convinced that you are the hero of the story coming down to serve someone else. You have to get down into the dirt. You have to admit your own thirst. Doing justice means you have to drink from the forbidden fountain. It means looking at a person in society who is labeled an outcast, an enemy, a failure, or whatever, and deciding to share your cup with them. Jesus did not walk away from the well that day. He looked at the woman who had been pushed to the absolute margins of her society, and he looked at a woman who carried the heavy weight of her own history. He knew everything she had done. He knew every single mistake she had ever made, every time she had ended up stuck in a ditch. He knew the deep systemic hostility that was supposed to keep them apart. He looked right into her eyes and said, "Give me a drink." That one sentence dismantled centuries of religious, political barricades. He did not give her a theological lecture. He did not ask her to clean up before he would have a conversation with her. He made himself vulnerable. He asked her for a drink of water so he could offer her an ocean of grace. He offered her living water. He told her that everyone drinks from the physical well of this world would eventually be thirsty again. We thirst for approval. We thirst for security. We thirst for comfort of our own segregated echo chambers. But the water Jesus gives becomes a spring gushing up in eternal life. It's the only thing that actually satisfies the deep, aching hollow of the human heart. When the woman realized she was finally truly seen, everything changed. She was completely known. She was not condemned. She was caught in the ditch of her own life, and the Messiah did not leave her there. The grace of that moment was so overwhelming that she did not something completely irrational. She left her water jar at the well. She left the heavy, burdensome thing that she had carried into the heat. She left her shame sitting in the dust, and she turned around and ran back to the exact same city she had been trying to avoid hours earlier. She ran through the streets shouting to the people to come and see a man who knew everything she had ever done. It's not said, but loved her anyway. She became the first evangelist to her people because Jesus was willing to bravely bridge the gap. Salvation sprang up in the parched and desperate Samaritan village. The people left the city and went to see him for themselves. They asked him to stay with them. The text tells us that he stayed there for 2 days, sleeping in their homes and eating at their tables. Love refused to honor an invisible fence. We are called to be a people who build those kinds of bridges. We're called to widen our tables until they look like the kingdom of heaven on earth. Christian Shell writes about the movement she calls front yard people. She and her husband had just moved into a new neighborhood in Austin with their 4 kids. One day, a delivery truck driver accidentally set a picnic table down in her front yard instead of in the back. She decided to leave it there. She painted it turquoise, her favorite color, and she just left it there a few feet from the sidewalk. She and her kids started doing what they would normally do at the kitchen table out in the front yard instead. At first, people walked by and passed and just kind of stared at her. It is a strange thing to see someone making themselves vulnerable to interruption. We're also conditioned to stay hidden in their backyards. But eventually, construction workers on a job nearby started taking their lunch breaks at the table. A babysitter walking with her kids in her care sat down to rest. Neighbors started stopping and introducing themselves. Within a few months, people were asking Kristen if they could paint their own table in their own yard. That is what bridge building actually looks like in the wild. It requires risking your own comfort. It takes guts, a little. The people in our neighborhoods are dying of thirst in the midday sun. They are sitting in their cars at the grocery store parking lot. They are walking down the sidewalk on Tuesday afternoon. They are sitting in the cubicle right next to yours, silently carrying a heavy jar of grief that they do not know how to put down. They are terrified that if anyone truly knew them, they would just reject them. I wanted to be rescued that day when I was stuck in the ditch. I just didn't want anybody to know that it had ever happened. I spent the whole afternoon trying to stay hidden, but grace found me anyway. People everywhere are waiting for someone to see them. They are waiting for someone to walk into the front yard, to look at them eye to eye and ask them for a drink. The living water is already flowing. The only question is whether we are going to walk away from the well, or if we are going to leave our heavy jars in the dust. Someone out there is thirsty. The bridge is waiting to be built. I wonder who is waiting for you to pull up a chair. Amen. And now let us go to God as we sing our hymn of response.